and an 8-hour day, the workers that were on strike tore up the leaflets, and quite often they beat them up as well, for good measure. Because they believed in the Tsar. They believed in the monarchy. They were monarchists. I repeat, how backward can you get? Apparently. And yet, after the massacre of the 9th of January, when the Tsars really shot down, we don't know how many, maybe 1,000, men, women, and children, on that demonstration, the very same night, the same workers, no, not different workers, the same workers came to the Bolsheviks with one demand: give us guns. Give us arms. The Bolsheviks didn't have arms. But that's how quickly the mood can change from what is apparently a backward conservative mood. In 24 hours, under certain conditions, it becomes transformed. And you see the genius of the working class. Now, don't talk to me about backward workers. You're more backward than that, apparently, you can't get. But they were able to stage a general strike, and they organized spontaneously. It wasn't Lenin or Trotsky. They organized a marvelous thing called the Soviets, starting with the Petersburg. So the word Soviet in Russian means council or committee. These were democratically elected strike committees, in effect, that were broadened to include other layers and so on. And that was an act of, it shows the genius, it shows the creativity of the working class, actually. Nobody told them how to do this. You won't find any mention of the Soviets in the classical writings of Karl Marx. The workers themselves, they naturally assumed this position because there were no legal unions, and they developed this marvelous, flexible organizational form. And the chairman, I repeat, the president of the first Petersburg Soviet was none other than Trotsky. He was a young man in his 20s, 25, 26 years of age, played a crucial role. I can't deal with the history of the first Russian Revolution. It's a subject in and of itself. We can return to that. But this revolution, it achieved marvelous successes. The Social Democrats grew by leaps and bounds. Probably they influenced hundreds of thousands of workers. From being a small group, they developed into hundreds of thousands within the space of 12 months. But unfortunately, for different reasons, the revolution was defeated. It was drowned in a sea of blood when in Moscow, the Moscow insurrection was defeated in December, and the whole thing went down into a period of profound reaction. You know, sometimes we complain, here comes, oh, we're working under difficult conditions, oh, it's difficult. Difficult? You don't know what difficult means. Here's a situation where thousands of people were killed. Hundreds of thousands were sent to prison in Siberia, tortured, beaten, and so on and so forth. And things were so bad. Everything was illegal. All the gains were liquidated. There were pogroms against the Jews and so on. And everything seemed to be lost. So bad was the situation that many young comrades committed suicide. Young members, they said, well, it's finished. It's no good. No hope. Committed suicide. Lenin had to go into exile. Trotsky had to go into exile. And start all over again. Yes, but sometimes it's necessary to start all over again. I'm not afraid of that. In exile, but it was Trotsky that produced the paper Pravda in Vienna in 1908, 1909. Lenin, unfortunately, at the time, later on pinched the name, that's the truth, which led to a little bit of bad blood between them. The Bolsheviks took over the name. The Bolshevik-Menshevik split finally was finalized in 1912. And what is interesting is that just prior to that, or rather just after that, there was an enormous wave of strikes and demonstrations again. I mean, the whole idea everything's finished, we can't do anything, the whole thing is shown to be wrong. The working class always will return to struggle. Even after the most bitter defeat, they'll return, but they have no alternative but to struggle, as a matter of fact. And therefore, 1911, 1912, 1913, 1940, there was another big movement of the working class. Big movement of a revolutionary movement. As a matter of fact, when the French president, Poincaré, visited Petersburg to discuss the forthcoming war with his friend the Tsar, he was horrified to see that there were demonstrators in the streets with red flags and barricades. In other words, Russia was moving in the direction of revolution yet again. And here again, unfortunately, the whole thing was cut across by the First World War. The First World War, the whole thing was destroyed. And again, Lenin had to go into exile, Trotsky had to go into exile, and so on. Now, here again, I repeat, you know, we complain too much We really do complain too much about difficulties. You just imagine the position faced by Lenin and Trotsky after 1914. Russia was once again ruled by the iron rod of Tsarism. All the concessions were liquidated. Lenin was in exile in Switzerland. Trotsky was in exile in Paris. Well, by the way, he did an extraordinary thing during the war. Just imagine, the whole of Europe is plunged into the kind of danse macabre, the dance of death. And all the ideas of internationalism and workers of the world unite have been trampled underfoot. The workers of the world are slaughtering each other. French and Belgian and British workers are in uniform are killing German and Austrian workers in uniform. A nightmare. The whole of Europe is dominated by police states. You can't move. Didn't have the internet in those days or mobile phones. It was a nightmare even to get a letter through from Switzerland to Russia. Lenin was completely isolated. Trotsky in Paris did a remarkable thing. On his own, he published a daily paper, Naša Slova, I think it was called, Our Word, which actually had quite a big, significant influence among the Russian soldiers that were stationed in France. It was a big success. He himself and one printer, on his own, printed the daily paper under those conditions. Just imagine that. The paper was closed down eventually by the French authorities, and Trotsky was deported to America. And while he was in America, this was in 1917, here's an interesting little story. This is a true story. In January 1917, Lenin was in exile in Switzerland. He was giving a lecture to a group of Swiss young socialists, same as I'm doing here with yourselves. And in the course of his speech, he said the following. He says, well, I'm an old man, and I probably will never live to see the socialist revolution. It's up to you, the youth, and so on, This is in January 1917. A couple of weeks later, the news came through that the Tsar had been overthrown by the Russian workers and soldiers, and 9 months later, Lenin was in power. Now, what was Trotsky? Trotsky was in New York. Lenin came to the conclusion that what was required in Russia after the overthrow of the Tsar was a socialist revolution, that the workers must take power, that the Soviets must take power, all power to the Soviets. That was the slogan. A lot of Bolshevik leaders were against that. Stalin was certainly opposed to it. Kamenev was opposed to it. There was a big row when Lenin came back on this question. But Trotsky in America came to exactly the same conclusion. I can't go in here to his marvelous theory, which is a real development of Marxism, the theory of the permanent revolution. Perhaps we can discuss this in the course of questions and discussion. But really speaking, it was this marvelous theory, the theory of the permanent revolution, that Trotsky elaborated as early as 1904, where he was the only one that predicted that the Russian workers could come to power before, say, the workers of Britain, France, or Germany. In other words, the working class could come to power in a backward country before an advanced country. That was one of the bases of the theory of permanent revolution. That was shown to be correct. It's precisely what happened in 1917. What was Trotsky's role in the revolution? Well, as I say, there's this marvelous book which you should all read. It's in 3 volumes. It's wonderful. But I guarantee you won't be able to put it down once you start to read this book. History of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky himself is a remarkable good document. But there's another book which I would recommend called 10 Days That Shook the World by an American socialist, John Reed. It's a very good book. But John Reed participated. He was an eyewitness to the events. And Lenin said later that this is a very truthful account of what occurred, and he explains what Trotsky's role was. Trotsky played an absolutely crucial role during the revolution, together with Lenin, even more than Lenin in some respects. Lenin was, for a period, in July and August, Lenin was forced again to go abroad, to flee to Finland, to escape from repression. It was Trotsky that played a crucial role in organizing. He was a marvelous speaker, by the way, a great mass orator. That's reflected in John Reed's book. And he was one of the main architects of the October Revolution, the 10 days that shook the world, to use John Reed's expression. And such was the role of Trotsky. You can check this if you read any newspaper. Check the Times or any other newspaper in the libraries and in the museums. you'll find that they actually persistently referred to the Bolshevik Party as the party of Lenin and Trotsky. The Lenin-Trotsky party, as if it was the same. Generally was the case. After the seizure of... One observation I would make. One of the main slanders which is directed against Lenin and Trotsky is that they're bloodthirsty monsters, there was a bloodbath, they like killing people and so on. This is entirely false. Let me tell you something you might not know. The Bolshevik Revolution of October 1970 was a bloodless revolution, insofar as that is possible. There were very few people who were killed, particularly in Petersburg. The reason being that the Bolsheviks had won. 9/10 of the work of the revolution was achieved before October. They'd won over the majority. They won over the majority of the workers, the majority of the Soviet soldiers in the Soviets. And there was very little resistance, actually. I'll give you a little anecdote. 10 years after the revolution, have you heard of the great Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein? Hands up who knows who's heard of Eisenstein. Some of you, not enough, not enough. You must all watch these wonderful films. I personally think he's the greatest film director that ever lived. Wonderful director. And one of his films is called October. And there's a famous scene in this film, which is the seizure of the Winter Palace. It's a remarkable piece of cinema. There's people charging and firing guns and throwing bombs and climbing up the gates and falling down dead. It's marvellous cinema. There's only one point. Historically, it leaves something to be desired. You know, more people were killed in making that scene than were actually killed in the seizure of the nobody was killed. But there was an accident on the film set and a couple of extras unfortunately lost their lives. The Russian Revolution was a relatively peaceful affair. What happened afterwards, however, is that Russia was invaded by 21 foreign armies of intervention. 21 foreign armies. British, French, Germans, Austrians, Americans, Japanese, Czechs, Poles, Romanians, you name it. 21 armies of intervention. And that was then a civil war started, and that was a real bloodbath. Now, why is it that they're so spiteful? That's the word. They're spiteful in relation to Trotsky in particular. You see, if you look at the history of the class struggle, you find that there are many slave rebellions. The slaves have revolted on many occasions. But every time they were defeated, take Spartacus, for example, every time the slaves were defeated, the ruling class took a terrible revenge. After the defeat of Spartacus, they crucified 6,000 slaves along the Via Appia, just to teach the masses a lesson. That's typical of the conduct of the ruling class. The difference here is that on this occasion, the slaves fought and the slaves won. That's what they can't forgive. They can't forgive that. It's bloodthirsty, it's terrible, it's violence. Of course it's violence, for God's sake. War means violence. And we have to distinguish between the violence of the oppressor and the defensive violence of the slaves. And we know where we stand in relation to that. The Russian army was destroyed. Russia was defenseless in the face of the Americans, the British, the French. And it was one man, Lenin said this to Gorky, one man was responsible for organizing the Red Army from nothing. The Workers' Red Army was organized by Lenin Trotsky. He personally supervised, personally led the fight against the counter-revolution in his famous armored train. You might have heard of that. It was a big train full of propaganda and leaflets and books and so on.